In the bitter cold of January 1875, the quiet farmlands of eastern Kansas were gripped by a fear that no winter storm could match. 7 years had passed since the name Timothy Caldwell last appeared in the ledgers of the Missouri State Hospital, name that, for some, still conjured memories of a boy whose mind confounded every doctor who tried to understand him. Now, a new shadow crept across the region, one that left a trail of unexplained deaths in its wake. The victims were always the most vulnerable, the elderly, the sick, those whose families had turned in desperation to a young caregiver who called himself Thomas Whitfield. He was a model of respectability, polite, intelligent, and always ready, with a gentle word or a steady hand. But beneath the surface, there was something unsettling about the way he moved from household to household, always arriving when hope was fading, and always gone before suspicion could take root. The deaths themselves were never violent, never messy. Instead, they bore the mark of clinical precision, as if the hand that guided them belonged not to a boy, but to a scientist conducting a grim experiment. Dr. Samuel Harding, once a respected physician, and now a man haunted by the failures of his past, found himself drawn back into the darkness he thought he had left behind. The journals he kept in Sedalia County filled with observations of a boy who dissected animals and spoke of pain with chilling detachment became his only guide as he began to track the pattern of death spreading across Kansas. Harding knew, perhaps better than anyone, that evil does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes, it wears the mask of compassion. Before we unravel the next chapter in the story of Timothy Caldwell, the boy science couldn't explain, make sure you've heard the beginning of this tale. Subscribe to Unseen Anthology and share your thoughts below. Do you remember where we left off with the boy who vanished from the asylum? The answers may be more disturbing than you imagine. The Kansas plains in 1875 were a place of hard-won hope and quiet desperation. The Civil War scars still lingered in the faces of settlers, and the land itself seemed to remember every hardship. In this landscape, the arrival of Thomas Whitfield was a blessing for many a young man with a gentle voice, a steady hand, and a reputation for easing the suffering of the old and infirm. He moved from farm to farm, his presence as unremarkable as the wind, and yet, in his wake, a pattern began to emerge that only the most observant could see. It was Dr. Benjamin Wheeler, the county physician for Leavenworth, who first noticed the oddities. Wheeler was a man of science, trained to trust evidence over rumor, but even he could not ignore the string of deaths that seemed to follow Thomas. The families spoke highly of the young caregiver, praising his skill and compassion. They described how he sat with their loved ones through the long nights, how he administered medicine with a precision that belied his age, and how he always seemed to know when the end was near. Yet, Wheeler could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The deaths were never violent. There were no bruises, no signs of struggle. Instead, the victims slipped away quietly, their passing attributed to the relentless march of age or illness. But Wheeler, who had seen death in all its forms, found the uniformity of these endings unsettling. Each patient died within weeks of Thomas's arrival, and always after he had warned the family to prepare for the worst. The young man's detachment was equally disturbing. He spoke of death with a clinical calm, asking questions about documentation and procedures that seemed out of place for someone so young. Wheeler began to keep notes, recording the details of each case. He noticed that Thomas never stayed in one place for long, moving on just as questions began to surface. His references were impeccable letters from grateful families, all vouching for his character and skill. But when Wheeler tried to verify these references, he found only dead ends. The families either did not exist or had never heard of Thomas Whitfield. As spring turned to summer, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Thomas's patients were always those most likely to die elderly, sick, or alone. Their families, grateful for his help, never questioned the timing of their loved ones' deaths. And when Thomas left, he took nothing but his small bag and the quiet gratitude of those he had served. Yet, Wheeler's unease grew with each passing week. The turning point came with the death of Reverend Jonathan Hartwell in Oscar. Hartwell was not like Thomas's other patients. Though his body was frail, his mind remained sharp, and he quickly sensed that something was amiss. He confided in his daughter, Elizabeth, telling her of the strange questions Thomas asked, and the cold, analytical way he watched his patient. Elizabeth, torn between her father's fears and her gratitude for Thomas's care, tried to stay vigilant. One afternoon, she heard her father cry out. Rushing to his room, she found Thomas standing over him, a pillow in his hands. Thomas claimed he had been adjusting the Reverend's bedding, but Hartwell, once revived, insisted that the young man had tried to smother him. Dr. Wheeler was summoned, and though the evidence was circumstantial, he could no longer ignore the possibility that Thomas was not what he seemed. Wheeler reached out to colleagues in neighboring counties, sharing his suspicions and gathering reports of similar deaths. The pattern was clear. Wherever Thomas Whitfield went, death followed. But the young man was always careful, always just out of reach. He moved with a precision that suggested not just cunning, but a deep understanding of human nature and the systems meant to protect the vulnerable. As the investigation widened, another name began to surface: Timothy Caldwell, the boy who had vanished from the Missouri State Hospital 7 years earlier. Dr. Samuel Harding, now retired but still haunted by the case, recognized the signs: the clinical detachment, the fascination with death, the ability to manipulate those around him. All were traits he had documented in his journals. Harding knew, with a certainty born of years of regret, that Thomas Whitfield and Timothy Caldwell were one and the same. Dr. Harding's return to the world of Timothy Caldwell was not a choice, but a compulsion. He had spent years trying to forget the boy whose mind had unsettled every physician at the Missouri State Hospital. Yet, as the letters from Dr. Wheeler arrived, each one describing another death, another family left in quiet mourning, Harding felt the old dread return. He pored over his journals, searching for patterns, for any clue that might explain how a child once confined to padded rooms could become a young man who moved through the world with such chilling purpose. The Missouri State Hospital had been Harding's domain for decades, a place where he believed science could illuminate even the darkest corners of the human mind. But Timothy had defied every diagnosis. As a child, he had been quiet, almost eerily so, with a gaze that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were precise, his questions unsettling. He dissected small animals with the curiosity of a scientist, but without the empathy of a child. Harding had documented it all, convinced that Timothy was a case study in the make and rare glimpse into the origins of evil. Now, as he read Wheeler's accounts of Thomas Whitfield, Harding saw the same patterns emerging: the calculated selection of victims, the careful manipulation of families, the ability to vanish before suspicion could take hold. It was as if Timothy had taken the lessons of the asylum and refined them into a method, a science of suffering. Harding's hands trembled as he packed his journals and prepared to travel to Kansas. He knew that he was not just chasing a killer, but confronting the limits of his own understanding. Meanwhile, Thomas Timothy continued his work with the same meticulous care. He moved from household to household, always choosing those who were isolated, those whose deaths would raise the fewest questions. He was unfailingly polite, attentive to his patients, and always ready with a plausible explanation for every symptom, every decline. Families trusted him, not just because of his skill, but because he seemed to care. He listened to their stories, comforted them in their grief, and left behind a trail of gratitude and sorrow. But beneath the surface, Timothy was conducting experiments. He observed how families responded to loss, how they rationalized the unexplained, how they clung to hope, even as it slipped away. He kept detailed notes, recording every reaction, every tear, every whispered prayer. To him, these were not just deaths, they were data points, pieces of a larger puzzle he was determined to solve. Dr. Wheeler, growing more convinced of Thomas's guilt, began to coordinate with other county officials. He compiled a list of deaths, cross-referenced them with Thomas's movements, and found a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The deaths clustered around the young caregiver's presence, each one following the same script: a period of apparent improvement, a sudden decline, and a death that seemed both inevitable and inexplicable. The breakthrough came when Wheeler discovered that Thomas's references were forgeries. The letters, though convincing, were written in the same careful hand, and the families they described could not be found. Wheeler realized that Thomas had constructed an entire identity out of lies, moving through the world as a ghost, leaving only questions in his wake. As Harding arrived in Kansas, he and Wheeler met in a small, dimly lit office, their faces drawn with worry and exhaustion. They shared their findings, piecing together the story of a boy who had become a man without conscience. Harding spoke of Timothy's childhood, of the cold intelligence that had both fascinated and terrified him. Wheeler described the recent deaths, the families left bewildered and broken. Together, they resolved to stop Timothy before he could claim another victim. They alerted law enforcement in every county where Thomas had worked, warning them to be vigilant. They tracked his movements, following the faint trail of grief and suspicion he left behind. But Timothy was always one step ahead, his plans unfolding with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. As summer faded into autumn, the tension grew. Harding and Wheeler knew that they were racing against time, that every day Timothy remained free was another day of risk for the vulnerable. They could only hope that their combined knowledge, Harding's understanding of Timothy's mind, Wheeler's grasp of his methods, would be enough to catch a killer who seemed to exist outside the reach of ordinary justice. The search for Timothy Caldwell, now Thomas Whitfield, became a desperate chess match played across the farmlands and small towns of Kansas. Dr. Harding and Dr. Wheeler, united by their shared sense of responsibility and dread, worked tirelessly to anticipate Timothy's next move. They sent telegrams to county sheriffs, posted warnings in local newspapers, and quietly urged families to be cautious of strangers offering care. Yet, for every lead they followed, Timothy seemed to slip further into the shadows, his trail growing colder with each passing week. Timothy's methods were as precise as they were chilling. He never stayed in one place long enough to arouse suspicion, and he always chose his patients carefully, those whose deaths would be attributed to age, illness, or the slow decline of the body. He ingratiated himself with families, offering comfort and practical help, and he was always ready with a plausible explanation for every setback. When a patient died, he handled the arrangements with a professionalism that left families grateful, even as they mourned. But Timothy's true genius lay in his ability to read people. He watched for signs of doubt, for the subtle shifts in conversation that might signal suspicion. If a family member began to question his methods, he would gently suggest that the stress of caregiving was clouding their judgment, or that grief was making them see things that weren't there. He was a master of deflection, always steering attention away from himself and toward the natural course of disease and death. Meanwhile, Dr. Harding and Dr. Wheeler pored over every detail they could find. They interviewed families, examined medical records, and compared notes late into the night. Harding's journals from the Missouri State Hospital became their guide, offering insights into Timothy's psychology that no one else could provide. He reminded Wheeler that Timothy was not driven by anger or revenge, but by a cold, scientific curiosity and need to understand suffering. To observe the boundaries of life and death, the investigation took a dramatic turn when a pattern of thefts emerged. In several households where Thomas had worked, small amounts of money and valuables had gone missing after the patient's death. At first, These losses were dismissed as the confusion of grief. But Wheeler began to suspect that Timothy was funding his travels through these minor crimes. The thefts were never large enough to draw attention, but they were frequent enough to suggest a calculated strategy. As the summer waned, a new sense of urgency gripped the investigators. Reports began to surface of Timothy's presence in Nebraska and Colorado, always under a new name, always with the same pattern of deaths and disappearances. Harding feared that Timothy was growing bolder, that his experiments were evolving into something even more dangerous. He worried that the young man's fascination with death was no longer enough, that he might soon seek to test the limits of human endurance in ways that would shock even the most hardened observer. One evening, as Harding and Wheeler sat in a dimly lit parlor, the old doctor spoke of his regrets. "I thought I could help him," Harding confessed, his voice heavy with guilt. "I thought that if I could understand what made him different, I could save him from himself. But I was wrong. Some minds are not meant to be understood. Some darkness cannot be brought into the light." Wheeler nodded, his own face drawn with fatigue. "We have to stop him, Samuel. For the families, for the children, for everyone who trusts us to keep them safe." Their resolve hardened. The two men redoubled their efforts. They coordinated with law enforcement across state lines, sharing every scrap of information they could find. They knew that Timothy was clever, that he would not be caught easily, but they also knew that he was not invincible. Every mistake, every slip, brought them one step closer to ending his reign of quiet terror. As autumn deepened, the first hints of frost appeared on the fields, and the days grew shorter. The investigators pressed on, driven by the knowledge that time was running out. Somewhere, Timothy Caldwell was planning his next move, and they could only hope that they would find him before he found his next victim. The first true break in the case came not from a lawman or a doctor, but from a woman named Elizabeth Hartwell. Her father, Reverend Jonathan Hartwell, had survived his encounter with Thomas Whitfield, and Elizabeth's testimony would become the thread that began to unravel Timothy Caldwell's carefully woven disguise. She described the way Thomas watched her father, not with the concern of a caregiver, but with the cold detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. She spoke of the night she found Thomas standing over her father's bed, pillow in hand, and the terror in her father's eyes when he whispered, "He tried to smother me." Elizabeth's account was detailed and unwavering. She remembered the questions Thomas asked about the family's finances, about the church, about the routines of the household. She recalled the way he seemed to know exactly when to offer comfort and when to withdraw, always keeping the family off balance, always in control. Her words painted a portrait of a young man who was both charming and chilling, a master manipulator who could slip between roles as easily as changing a coat. Dr. Wheeler and Dr. Harding seized on Elizabeth's testimony, using it to convince local authorities that Thomas Whitfield was not merely an unlucky caregiver, but a predator hiding in plain sight. They began to piece together a timeline of his movements, tracing his path from Missouri to Kansas, and now, it seemed, into Nebraska. Each stop along the way was marked by the same pattern: a vulnerable family, a period of apparent healing, and then a sudden, inexplicable death. The investigation gained momentum as more families came forward, their stories echoing Elizabeth's. Some spoke of small thefts, missing jewelry, a few dollars gone from a drawer. Others remembered the way Thomas seemed to vanish just as questions began to arise. The pattern was undeniable, and the sense of dread grew with each new revelation. Meanwhile, Timothy, still using the name Thomas, was already planning his next move. He had learned to anticipate suspicion, to sense when the walls were closing in. He began to forge new references, create new identities, and seek out families even farther from the reach of the law. His methods grew more sophisticated, his experiments more ambitious. He was no longer content with individual deaths. He wanted to understand how entire families responded to loss, how grief could be manipulated, how love could be turned into a weapon. Dr. Harding, haunted by his memories of Timothy as a boy, recognized the signs of escalation. He warned the authorities that Timothy was not just a killer, but a student of human suffering, always searching for new ways to test the limits of endurance and despair. "He's not satisfied with what he's learned," Harding told Wheeler one night. "He's looking for something more, something that will make his work unforgettable." The search intensified. Lawmen rode out to distant farms, warning families to be wary of strangers. Doctors shared information across county lines, comparing notes and looking for patterns. The newspapers began to whisper of a death angel moving through the countryside, a shadow that brought sorrow wherever it fell. But Timothy was always a step ahead. He watched the investigators as closely as they watched him, studying their methods, anticipating their moves. He changed his appearance, altered his mannerisms, and left behind just enough evidence to keep them guessing. He was a ghost in the wheatfields, a rumor in the night, and for every door that closed to him, another seemed to open, as the days grew shorter and the nights colder. The sense of urgency mounted. Dr. Harding and Dr. Wheeler knew that they were running out of time. Timothy's experiments were growing bolder, his need for control more desperate. They could only hope that, somewhere along the line, he would make a mistake, a single misstep that would finally bring his reign of terror to an end. The autumn of 1875 brought a restless wind to the plains, carrying with it rumors and warnings. Timothy Caldwell, under the name Thomas Whitfield, had become a legend, whispered about in kitchens and churchyards. Some called him a healer, others a curse. But for Dr. Harding and Dr. Wheeler, the legend was all too real, a living, breathing threat that moved with uncanny precision through the heartland. Timothy's next target was the Henderson family of Lancaster County, Nebraska. The Hendersons were prosperous but isolated, their farmstead miles from the nearest neighbor. William Henderson, the patriarch, had grown frail, and his family was desperate for help. When Thomas Whitfield arrived, recommended by a letter that seemed beyond reproach, they welcomed him with open arms. He was attentive, knowledgeable, and seemed to know exactly what William needed. The family's relief was palpable. For the first time in months, they felt hope. But Timothy's presence was a carefully constructed trap. He observed the family's routines, noting their strengths and weaknesses. He ingratiated himself with each member, offering comfort to Margaret, advice to the adult children, and gentle stories to the grandchildren. He watched how they interacted, how they responded to stress, how they coped with William's decline. Every detail was recorded in his journal, every reaction catalogued for later analysis. Meanwhile, Dr. Harding and Dr. Wheeler, following the trail of forged references and suspicious deaths, realized that Timothy was planning something new, something larger and more dangerous than before. The pattern of his movements, the increasing sophistication of his methods, all pointed to a culmination. Harding's old fears returned, sharper than ever. He knew that Timothy was not content with isolated acts of violence. He wanted to orchestrate a tragedy on a scale that would test the very limits of human endurance. The investigators raced to warn the Hendersons, but the distances were vast and communication slow. By the time they reached Lancaster County, Timothy had already begun his experiment. The Hendersons, once a close-knit family, found themselves unraveling under the strain. William's health declined rapidly. Margaret grew withdrawn, and the children argued over every decision. Timothy, always calm and composed, offered solutions that only deepened the divisions. One night, as a storm raged outside, Timothy set his plan in motion. He isolated each family member, inventing reasons for them to be alone in different parts of the house. He tampered with the well, loosened the supports in the barn, and left a lantern burning in the root cellar. Each act was calculated to create danger, to force the family into choices that would reveal their deepest fears and loyalties. Dr. Harding and Dr. Wheeler arrived at the Henderson farm just as the storm broke. The house was eerily quiet, the windows dark. They found William tied to a chair, barely conscious, and Margaret drugged on the sofa. The children and grandchildren were missing, hidden somewhere on the property. The investigators split up, searching the barn, the cellar, the wellhouse location, a carefully constructed trap. Timothy watched from the shadows, his journal in hand. He recorded every decision, every moment of panic, every act of courage or despair. For him, this was the ultimate experiment, a chance to observe how love and fear battled for control, how families broke or held together under unimaginable pressure. As dawn broke, the rescuers managed to save the remaining family members, though not without injury and trauma. Timothy, sensing that his experiment was over, surrendered without resistance. He greeted Dr. Harding with a cold, satisfied smile, as if to say, "You see, I have learned more than you ever imagined." The Henderson case would become the centerpiece of the investigation, a testament to Timothy's cunning and cruelty. For Dr. Harding and Dr. Wheeler, it was a bitter victory. They had stopped a killer, but not before he had left an indelible mark on everyone he touched. The aftermath of the Henderson ordeal rippled through the region, like a stone cast into still water. News of the family's suffering and the strange, clinical cruelty behind it spread quickly, leaving neighbors shaken and authorities scrambling for answers. The Hendersons survived, but the scars ran deep. William never fully recovered, and Margaret's nights were haunted by dreams of captivity and confusion. The children, once lively and trusting, grew wary of strangers, their innocence eroded by the ordeal. For Dr. Harding and Dr. Wheeler, the case was both a triumph and a torment. They had finally caught up with Timothy Caldwell, but the cost was high. The journals and notes Timothy left behind at the Henderson farm revealed the full extent of his obsession. Page after page detailed not only the physical manipulations, but the psychological games he played, how he sowed distrust, engineered crises, and forced his victims to make impossible choices. Each entry was written with the detachment of a scientist, but the content was chilling. Subject A, Margaret responds to isolation with withdrawal and silence. Subject B, James exhibits aggression when denied access to family. Subject C, child demonstrates resilience, but is easily manipulated by fear. The authorities, now fully aware of the scope of Timothy's crimes, moved quickly to secure him. He was transported under heavy guard to a secure facility where he was to await trial. The press seized on the story, dubbing him the boy science couldn't explain. Reporters speculated endlessly about his motives, his upbringing, and the failures of the institutions that had tried and failed to contain him. In the days that followed, Dr. Harding spent long hours interviewing Timothy. The young man was cooperative, even eager to discuss his work. He spoke of his years on the run as a period of research, a time when he could observe human nature without interference. "I wanted to see what people would do when pushed to their limits," Timothy explained, his voice calm and almost pleasant. "Most people break. Some surprise you. But everyone reveals something true about themselves in the end." Harding pressed him on the morality of his actions, but Timothy only shrugged. "Morality is a construct, Doctor. I was interested in truth, not comfort. I wanted to know what lies beneath the surface, what people are capable of when the rules no longer apply." The trial that followed was a spectacle. Families from across Kansas and Missouri came forward to testify, their stories echoing the same pattern: a loved one in need, a helpful young caregiver, a sudden decline, and a death that seemed both natural and inexplicable. The evidence was overwhelming, but the question of Timothy's sanity loomed large. Was he a monster, or a product of a mind science could not yet understand? Dr. Harding's testimony was crucial. He described Timothy's childhood, his early signs of detachment, and the chilling evolution from curiosity to cruelty. He spoke of the journals, the experiments, and the calculated way Timothy had used his intelligence to exploit the trust of others. He is not insane in the traditional sense, Harding told the court. He is rational, methodical, and fully aware of his actions. But he lacks the capacity for empathy. He understands suffering, but only as an observer, never as a participant. The jury deliberated for days, torn between horror and fascination. In the end, Timothy was found guilty on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge ordered that he be held in a facility equipped to study his unique psychological profile, hoping that some good might come from understanding the darkness that had driven him. For Dr. Harding and Dr. Wheeler, the case was over, but the questions remained. Could Timothy have been saved? Was he born without empathy, or had something in his past twisted his mind beyond repair? And most haunting of all, were there others like him, hiding behind masks of kindness, waiting for their chance to test the limits of human endurance? Timothy Caldwell's incarceration marked the end of his reign of terror, but it was only the beginning of a new chapter in the study of the human mind. The facility where he was held was unlike any ordinary prison. It was a place where doctors, psychologists, and researchers came from across the country, eager to observe and interview the young man whose crimes had confounded the boundaries of science and morality. Timothy became both a cautionary tale and a living experimenta subject, whose every word and gesture was recorded, analyzed, and debated. Dr. Harding visited Timothy regularly, driven by a sense of unfinished responsibility. Their conversations were long and often unsettling. Timothy spoke with the same clinical detachment that had characterized his journals, describing his crimes as if they were case studies rather than tragedies. He showed no remorse, only curiosity. "I learned more from the Hendersons than from any other family," he told Harding one afternoon, his pale eyes unblinking. "They were strong, but even strength has its limits. I wanted to see what would happen if I pushed them just a little further." Harding pressed him, searching for any sign of regret or understanding. "Do you ever think about the pain you caused, the lives you destroyed?" Timothy considered the question, then shook his head. "I think about the data, about what I learned. Pain is a veritable doctor. It's not personal, it's just part of the process." The research community was divided. Some saw Timothy as a monster, a warning of what could happen when empathy was absent from intelligence. Others argued that he was a product of his environment, a mind shaped by trauma and neglect. The debate spilled into the newspapers, fueling public fascination and fear. Was Timothy Caldwell evil, or simply broken in a way that science had yet to explain? Meanwhile, Dr. Wheeler returned to his practice, forever changed by the case. He found himself looking at his patients differently, searching for signs of hidden darkness. He became more cautious, more attentive to the small details that might signal trouble. The memory of Timothy's calm, calculating gaze haunted him, a reminder that evil could wear the most ordinary of faces. The Henderson family struggled to rebuild their lives. William's health never fully recovered, and Margaret withdrew from the world, her trust in others shattered. The children grew up wary and watchful, their childhood innocence replaced by a hard-earned wisdom. The community rallied around them, offering support and sympathy, but the scars remained. Timothy's journals became a source of both horror and insight. Researchers pored over his meticulous notes, searching for patterns, for clues that might help prevent future tragedies. The journals revealed a mind obsessed with control, with understanding the mechanics of suffering. Timothy wrote about his victims with the same precision he applied to his experiments, cataloging their reactions, their fears, their final moments. For Dr. Harding, the case became a lifelong study. He published articles and gave lectures, warning of the dangers posed by minds like Timothy's. He argued for early intervention, for better screening and support for children who showed signs of emotional detachment. "We must not turn away from what frightens us," he told his colleagues. "We must confront it, study it, and learn from it, no matter how uncomfortable the truth may be. Yet, even as the world moved on, the questions lingered. Was Timothy Caldwell unique, or was he the first of a new kind of criminal, one who used intelligence and charm as weapons, who saw people as puzzles to be solved, rather than lives to be cherished? The answers remained elusive, hidden in the shadows, where science and morality met. As the years passed, Timothy Caldwell's case became a touchstone for a new generation of psychologists and criminologists. His name appeared in textbooks and lectures, his journals cited in debates about the origins of evil and the limits of rehabilitation. The facility where he was held became a center for research, attracting experts eager to unlock the secrets of a mind that seemed both brilliant and barren. Yet, for all the attention, Timothy himself remained unchanged, calm, observant, and utterly unrepentant. Dr. Harding continued his visits, though each one left him more unsettled than the last. He watched as Timothy manipulated the staff, earning privileges through good behavior, only to use them as opportunities for further observation. Timothy treated the prison like a laboratory, studying the guards, the other inmates, even the doctors who came to interview him. He kept new journals, filling them with notes on human behavior, on the subtle ways people revealed their fears and desires. One day, Harding brought a young psychologist, Dr. Alice Monroe, to meet Timothy. She was eager, idealistic, and convinced that even the most damaged mind could be reached. Timothy greeted her with polite curiosity, answering her questions with the same clinical detachment he showed everyone else. But as the interview progressed, Monroe sensed the emptiness behind his words. "Do you ever feel lonely, Timothy?" she asked gently. He considered the question, then smiled. "Loneliness is a feeling, Dr. Monroe. I observe it in others, but I don't experience it myself. I'm interested in how people respond to isolation, but for me, it's just another variable." Monroe left the interview shaken, her optimism tempered by the realization that some minds might truly be unreachable. She wrote in her notes, "Timothy Caldwell is not simply a product of trauma or neglect. He is a reminder that there are limits to what empathy and understanding can achieve. Some darkness cannot be illuminated." Meanwhile, the Henderson family's ordeal became a rallying point for reform. Lawmakers pushed for stricter regulations on caregivers, for better background checks, and more oversight. The case was cited in debates about mental health, about the need for early intervention, and support for at-risk children. William Henderson, though weakened, became an advocate for change, speaking at town meetings and urging others to learn from his family's suffering. Dr. Wheeler, too, found a new purpose. He began working with local schools, teaching teachers and parents how to recognize signs of emotional detachment and manipulation. He spoke of Timothy not as a monster, but as a warning, a reminder that evil could grow in silence, unnoticed, until it was too late. Timothy's own writings continued to fascinate and disturb. He described his crimes with chilling clarity, analyzing his victims' responses as if they were specimens in an experiment. "Fear is the most reliable motivator," he wrote. "It reveals the truth of a person's character. Love is less predictable, but more interesting. It can drive people to acts of great courage or great foolishness." For Dr. Harding, the case became a burden he could never fully set down. He spent his final years writing, lecturing, and urging his colleagues to confront the uncomfortable truths Timothy's life had revealed. "We must not look away," he insisted. "We must study the darkness, not to excuse it, but to understand it and, if possible, to prevent it from taking root again." Yet, even as the world learned from Timothy Caldwell, the man himself remained a mystery. He watched the world through the bars of his cell, recording, analyzing, and waiting. For him, life was an endless experiment, and humanity was both his subject and his puzzle. By the turn of the decade, Timothy Caldwell's name had become synonymous with a new kind of fear, one rooted not in the wild violence of outlaws, but in the cold, methodical cruelty of a mind that saw people as data points. His case was discussed in university halls and police academies alike, a cautionary tale for anyone who believed that evil always wore a monstrous face. Yet, for all the study and speculation, Timothy himself remained an enigma, his motivations as inscrutable as ever. Inside the facility, Timothy adapted to his new environment with unsettling ease. He became a model prisoner, never causing trouble, always polite to staff and fellow inmates. But those who watched him closely saw the calculation in his every move. He observed the routines of the guards, the shifting alliances among prisoners, the subtle cues that revealed who was vulnerable and who was not. He kept meticulous notes, filling page after page with observations and theories. Dr. Harding, now aging and increasingly frail, continued his visits, determined to glean whatever insight he could from Timothy's mind. Their conversations grew more philosophical, touching on questions of morality, free will, and the nature of suffering. Harding pressed Timothy to reflect on his actions, to consider the pain he had caused. But Timothy's answers remained clinical, devoid of remorse. "Pain is information," he would say. "It tells you where the limits are." I was always interested in finding those limits. Outside the prison walls, the world was changing. Advances in psychology and criminology were reshaping how society understood crime and punishment. Timothy's case became a touchstone for debates about the origins of psychopathy, the possibility of rehabilitation, and the responsibilities of families and institutions. Some argued that Timothy was a product of his environment, a child failed by those who should have protected him. Others insisted that he was born different. His lack of empathy, a flaw that no amount of care could have corrected. The Henderson family, though forever marked by their ordeal, found a measure of peace and advocacy. William Henderson's health declined, but he remained a voice for reform until his death. Margaret and the children moved to a nearby town, seeking a fresh start. They spoke rarely of what had happened, but their experience shaped their lives in quiet, lasting ways. Timothy's journals, now studied by experts around the world, offered a window into a mind that was both brilliant and barren. He wrote about his experiments with the same detachment he had shown in life, analyzing his victims' responses, cataloging their fears and hopes. "People are predictable," he wrote. "Given the right conditions, they will always reveal themselves. The challenge is to create those conditions and observe the results." For Dr. Harding, the case became a legacy he could not escape. He published his findings, warning of the dangers posed by minds like Timothy's. He urged his colleagues to look beyond the surface, to recognize the signs of emotional detachment and manipulation before it was too late. "We must be vigilant," he wrote. The darkness that grew in Timothy Caldwell did not appear overnight. It was nurtured in silence, in neglect, in the spaces where no one was watching. As the years passed, Timothy's influence lingered. His case shaped policies, inspired research, and haunted the dreams of those who had come too close to his darkness. Yet, for all the lessons learned, the central mystery remained. Was Timothy Caldwell a monster created by circumstance, or a warning of something deeper and more troubling in the human soul? The years in the institution did little to dull Timothy Caldwell's sharp intellect or his appetite for observation. He became a fixture in the facility's library, devouring books on medicine, psychology, and philosophy. The staff, wary but fascinated, often found themselves drawn into conversations with him, only to leave unsettled by his probing questions and the way he seemed to see through their every pretense. Timothy's cell was lined with notebooks, each one a testament to his relentless curiosity, a private archive of human behavior, meticulously catalogued and analyzed. Dr. Alice Monroe, now leading the research team, continued the work Dr. Harding had begun. She approached Timothy with a mixture of caution and professional detachment, determined not to be drawn in by his charm or intellect. Their interviews, became a battleground of wits, with Timothy testing her boundaries, searching for weaknesses. Monroe, for her part, was careful to keep the focus on Timothy's experiences, pressing him to reflect on his past and the choices he had made. "Do you ever regret what you did?" she asked during one session, her voice steady. Timothy considered the question, his expression unreadable. "Regret is a function of empathy, Dr. Monroe. I understand the concept, but I don't experience it. My actions were logical, given my goals. I wanted to understand people, to see what they would do under pressure. The suffering was incidental." Monroe pressed further, hoping to find some crack in his composure. "And what about now? Do you ever wonder what your life might have been if things had been different?" Timothy's eyes flickered with something like amusement. "I wonder what I might have discovered with better resources, more subjects. But as for my life, I am what I am. The world is a laboratory, and I am its observer." Outside the institution, the Caldwell case continued to shape the world of criminal psychology. Monroe and her colleagues published papers on Timothy's unique profile, sparking debates about the nature of evil and the limits of rehabilitation. Some argued that Timothy's lack of empathy was a rare anomaly, a tragic accident of biology. Others saw, in him, a warning sign that society must be vigilant, that darkness could grow in the most unexpected places. The Henderson family's story became a touchstone for advocates of reform. Margaret, though still haunted by memories, spoke at public meetings about the need for better oversight of caregivers and more support for families in crisis. The children, now grown, carried the lessons of their ordeal into their own lives, determined to protect others from suffering as they had. Timothy's influence extended even to those who had never met him. His journals, now required reading in some academic circles, challenged students and professionals alike to confront uncomfortable truths about the human mind. "We are all capable of darkness," Monroe wrote in one of her articles. "The question is not whether evil exists, but how we recognize it and what we do when it appears among us." Within the institution, Timothy remained a model prisoner, his behavior impeccable, his insights invaluable to researchers. Yet, those who spent time with him could not shake the sense that he was always watching, always learning, always waiting for the next opportunity to test the boundaries of human nature. As another winter settled over the plains, Dr. Monroe found herself reflecting on the legacy of Timothy Caldwell. She wondered if true understanding was possible, or if some mysteries were destined to remain unsolved. In the quiet of her office, she reread Harding's final notes, searching for answers in the margins of a story that had changed the course of her own life. Timothy Caldwell's presence in the institution became a paradox. He was both a source of dread and a wellspring of knowledge. New staff members were warned about his charm, his intelligence, and his uncanny ability to turn a simple conversation into a psychological test. Some avoided him altogether, while others, drawn by curiosity or ambition, sought him out, hoping to glean insights that might advance their own careers. Timothy welcomed all comers, treating each interaction as another opportunity to observe, to record, to understand. Dr. Monroe, now recognized as a leading authority on criminal psychopathy, continued her regular interviews with Timothy. She brought in visiting scholars, law enforcement officials, and even clergy, each hoping to unlock the secrets of his mind. Timothy answered their questions with the same calm detachment, never revealing more than he intended, always steering the conversation back to his favorite subject, the limits of human behavior. One afternoon, a young detective from Chicago visited the institution, seeking advice on a series of unsolved murders. He described the killers' methods careful, calculated, and eerily reminiscent of Timothy's own crimes. Timothy listened intently, then offered his analysis. "You're looking for someone who sees people as puzzles, not as lives. He'll be charming, helpful, and always just out of reach. He'll make you doubt your instincts, because that's part of the game. The detective left with a new sense of purpose, but also a chill that lingered long after he returned to the city. Timothy's words had the ring of truth, and the unsettling implication that there might be others like him hidden, waiting, learning from his example. Meanwhile, Dr. Monroe began to notice subtle changes in Timothy's demeanor. He seemed less interested in the daily routines of the institution, more focused on the world beyond its walls. He asked for newspapers, for books about current events, for reports on advances in science and technology. Monroe wondered if he was planning something, or if he was simply restless, his mind hungry for new challenges. The research community continued to debate Timothy's legacy. Some argued that he was a singular anomaly, a case that would never be repeated. Others saw him as a harbinger of a new kind of criminal, one who used intelligence and empathy as tools for manipulation rather than connection. The debate spilled into the public sphere, fueling fears and inspiring new protocols for screening and monitoring those in positions of trust. The Henderson family, though years removed from their ordeal, remained a symbol of resilience. Margaret, now elderly, found solace in her grandchildren, teaching them the importance of vigilance and compassion. The children, shaped by their experiences, became advocates for mental health reform, determined to prevent others from suffering as they had. Timothy's journals, now preserved in a secure archive, continued to yield insights for those brave enough to study them. Researchers found patterns in his observations, clues to the early warning signs of psychopathy, and strategies for intervention. Yet, for all the knowledge gained, the essential mystery of Timothy Caldwell remained unsolved. Dr. Monroe, reflecting on her years of work, wrote in her final report, "Timothy Caldwell forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can be both ordinary and extraordinary. He is a mirror, reflecting the darkest possibilities of the human mind. Our task is not to look away, but to learn, to prepare, and to hope that understanding can lead to prevention." As the institution settled into another quiet night, Timothy sat by his window, watching the snow fall. He was content, for now, to be the subject of study, the center of a mystery that would outlive him. But those who knew him best understood that, even in confinement, Timothy Caldwell was never truly at rest. The years rolled on, and Timothy Caldwell's legend only grew. His case became a fixture in academic circles, a required study for every aspiring psychologist and criminal investigator. The journals he left behind, filled with observations, diagrams, and chillingly precise accounts of his crimes, were pored over by experts seeking to understand the roots of his pathology. Yet, for all the analysis, Timothy himself remained unchanged, a living riddle whose mind seemed impervious to remorse or regret. Within the institution, Timothy's influence was subtle but pervasive. He became a mentor of sorts to other inmates, offering advice on how to navigate the rules, how to manipulate the staff, how to survive in a world built on routine and surveillance. Some guards resented his presence, seeing him as a corrupting force, while others found themselves drawn into his orbit, fascinated by his intelligence and the eerie calm that never left him. Dr. Monroe, now older and more cautious, continued her work with Timothy, though she often wondered if she was learning from him or simply being studied in return. Their conversations had grown more philosophical, touching on questions of fate, morality, and the nature of evil. "Do you believe you could have been different, Timothy?" she asked one winter afternoon, her voice tinged with sadness. Timothy considered the question, his gaze distant. "I believe I am the sum of my experiences and my nature. Change one variable, and perhaps the outcome would be different. But I am not sure the result would be better. I am what I am, Dr. Monroe. The world made me, and I made myself." Outside the institution, the world continued to grapple with the implications of Timothy's case. New laws were passed, requiring stricter background checks for caregivers and more rigorous psychological screening for those in positions of trust. The Henderson family's story was cited in legislative debates, a reminder of the cost of complacency and the need for vigilance. Yet, for all the reforms, the essential questions remained. Was Timothy Caldwell a singular aberration, or a warning of what could happen when empathy failed to take root? Could science ever truly explain the darkness that had shaped his life, or was some part of the human mind destined to remain unknowable? Dr. Monroe, reflecting on her years with Timothy, found herself haunted by the same doubts that had plagued Dr. Harding. She wrote in her journal, "We study monsters not to excuse them, but to understand the boundaries of our own humanity. Timothy Caldwell is a boundary, a line we must not cross, but one we must never forget exists." As another spring arrived, Timothy remained a model prisoner, his days marked by routine and observation. He watched the world change from behind the walls, his mind as sharp and restless as ever. For him, life was still an experiment, and he was both subject and scientist, forever seeking the answer to a question only he could truly understand. As Timothy Caldwell entered his later years, the institution around him changed, but his presence remained a constant and unsettling reminder of the limits of understanding and the persistence of darkness. New doctors and researchers arrived, eager to make their mark, but most left with more questions than answers. Timothy's reputation preceded him, and even those who prided themselves on their objectivity found themselves unsettled by his calm, analytical gaze. Dr. Monroe, now nearing retirement, made her final visits to Timothy's cell with a sense of closure and resignation. Their conversations had become almost ritualistic, a dance of questions and answers that circled the same unresolvable mysteries. "Do you ever fear death, Timothy?" she asked one gray morning, the rain tapping softly against the barred window. Timothy smiled, a faint, almost wistful expression. "Death is the last variable, Dr. Monroe. I am curious, not afraid. I have observed it in others, but I have not yet experienced it myself. When it comes, I will record what I can." The institution's administrators, recognizing the value of Timothy's insights, continued to allow researchers access to his journals and to him personally. His writings became foundational texts in the study of psychopathy, and his case was cited in courtrooms and classrooms across the country. Yet, for all the knowledge gained, Timothy's essential nature remained elusive, a puzzle with missing pieces. Outside the institution, the world moved on. The Henderson family's grandchildren grew up, carrying the legacy of their family's ordeal into their own lives. Some became doctors, others teachers, or advocates for mental health reform. They spoke of their family's suffering not as a curse, but as a lesson, a warning that vigilance and compassion must go hand in hand. Dr. Monroe's final report on Timothy Caldwell was both a summation and a confession. "We have learned much from Timothy," she wrote, "but we have not learned enough. His life is a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the blindness of our science. We must continue to ask hard questions, to look for early signs, to intervene when we can. But we must also accept that some mysteries will remain, and that our duty is not only to understand, but to protect." Timothy's health began to fail, but his mind remained sharp. He continued to write, to observe, to analyze. In his final months, he filled notebook after notebook with reflections on his life, his crimes, and the world that had both shaped and confined him. "I regret nothing," he wrote in one of his last entries. "Regret is for those who believe they could have been different. I am what I am, and I have seen what I wished to see." When Timothy Caldwell died, the institution marked his passing with little ceremony. His body was buried in a simple grave, but his legacy endured in the laws that bore his name, in the research that sought to explain him, and in the lives forever changed by his actions. Timothy Caldwell's death, in the spring of 1923, closed a chapter that had haunted American criminal psychology For more than half a century, the institution where he spent his final years, quietly, archived his journals, and researchers from across the country requested access to the documents that had become legendary in their field. For decades, his case would be cited as both a warning and a challenge, a reminder that the boundaries of human understanding are never as clear as we hope. In the years that followed, the Caldwell case shaped the way society approached the care of the vulnerable. New laws required rigorous background checks for caregivers, and the field of forensic psychology grew in both sophistication and caution. The Henderson family's story was retold in textbooks and lectures, a testament to the resilience of those who survived and the vigilance required to prevent such tragedies from recurring. Dr. Monroe, now retired, often reflected on her years with Timothy. She found herself returning to the same questions that had troubled Dr. Harding before her. Was Timothy Caldwell born without empathy, or was he shaped by a world that failed to nurture it? Could his darkness have been prevented, or was it inevitably rare but natural aberration of the human mind? In her memoirs, she wrote, "Timothy's life was a study in the limits of science and the persistence of mystery. We learned much from him, but the most important lesson was humility." The journals Timothy left behind continued to influence generations of psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement officers. His meticulous records of manipulation, observation, and control became required reading for those seeking to understand the roots of psychopathy. Yet, for all the knowledge gained, the essential question remained: could there be others like him, hidden in plain sight, waiting for their own opportunity to test the boundaries of human suffering? The Henderson descendants, now scattered across the country, carried the memory of their family's ordeal as both a burden and a call to action. Some became advocates for mental health reform, others worked in law enforcement or social services, determined to protect the vulnerable and recognize the warning signs that had once gone unnoticed. As the decades passed, Timothy Caldwell's story faded from headlines, but never from the annals of criminal psychology. His life and crimes remained a dark mirror, reflecting the complexities of evil, the failures of society, and the enduring hope that understanding, even if incomplete, could lead to prevention. In the end, Timothy Caldwell was not just a killer or a case study. He was a question that could never be fully answered, a shadow that lingered at the edge of science and conscience. And as long as there are mysteries in the human mind, his story will remain a warning, a lesson, and a challenge for all who seek to understand the darkness within. What do you believe shaped Timothy Caldwell into the enigma he became? A mind science struggled to explain, a soul untouched by remorse. Was he born without empathy, or did the world's failures create the darkness within him? And perhaps most chilling of all, could there be others like him, hidden among us, waiting for their moment? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Unseen Anthology for more journeys into the shadows of history and the mystery